It's a pleasure to welcome all of you and to welcome our guest of honor today, who's much more used to, I think, interviewing people than being interviewed. This is Gerard Wellbrock, the voice of the Fort Hays State Tigers. Now, I had to write down all of your accolades here, so I'm going to read them off because, you know, you've had so many awards, I can't really remember them all. But according to my research, in 2017, you were the Kansas Sportscaster of the Year. You won that honor from the National Sports Media Association. You have been the three-time KSHA Sportscaster of the Year for Kansas, whatever high school is, sports, whatever it is. All of those initials that I can't remember off the top of my head. And then the Hod Humiston, is that how you say his name?
Very good, yes.
Award from the Kansas Association of Broadcasters. So it's always a pleasure to welcome such a well-honored person to our Tiger Tuesdays. So welcome. As we like to do, we would like for you to start by telling us your Fort Hays story. We know that you're a graduate from 1990 and of course have been the voice of the Tigers for a while. So tell us about all of that.
Well, I grew up in Victoria, so obviously very much aware of Fort Hays State throughout my entire life, and that's where I went to school. I always obviously enjoyed sports, participated as best I could growing up, and always just had a fascination for radio growing up. So sportscasting was kind of a natural fit because of the two things. And I don't know, I just always thought I would be pretty good at it. Apparently I was told by some aunts and other people that I would be calling games all the time when I was younger. And then Fort Hays State gave me an opportunity to do things because it was smaller than a KU or a K-State sooner. And so we're able to call games and just get involved in the program quicker that way and do things that other schools you may have to wait till you're a junior or a senior to do. And just took off from there. Loved my 4 years. Really honored I got to take some classes from Jack Heather right before he retired. I think he retired after my sophomore year, so I got to take a couple of courses from him, and that was fun and unique. He was a unique individual, but I'm so glad I had that opportunity before his retirement. And then I worked in Phillipsburg for 2 years, had the opportunity to come back to Hays, did the Hays High TMP games, did color for Fort Hays State when I came back. And then in 2002, got a chance to be the voice of the Tigers and have been doing that ever since.
So yeah, I only had the opportunity to meet Jack Heather once. And shortly before he passed. And yes, for those of you who did not know Jack Heather, you certainly missed out on an experience.
If you met him once, you never forgot him.
That is for certain. So this is the question that I teased at the end of last week's Tiger Tuesday. What does a sportscaster do when all sports get shut down?
Well, he realizes that he really has one skill maybe, and that is being a broadcaster and calling games, because got started on some backyard projects because the window is usually smaller on those, because I do Hays Larks baseball in the summer, and we have a son who plays baseball. So that occupies a lot of the summer, but had a much bigger window to do some of those projects and realized I'm not really good at them. So I did find out that what I do is what I do best. It was weird when everything broke and then the games got postponed and then eventually the spring sports were canceled. It was a weird time. My son was fortunate to be able to suit up for Hays High varsity. They went to state and they played on a Wednesday night. And as we got to Emporia for their game, started to see the NBA, and then Curtis Hammocky gave me a phone call, started to hear about the women were ready to play the regional. And then he called to give an update, and you can kind of see, hey, things may not happen. They were not going to let us broadcast, actually, the regional game. They're trying to work around that so the radio crews could still call the game. And then, by the next morning, I kind of hung around Emporia because I was going to leave and go there the next day. And on the way to Maryville, or to Warrensburg, we got the phone call that the tournament was off, and then eventually all the spring sports. So it's just a weird time, and hoping we can go this fall, because I'm certainly missing it.
And is your family ready to get you out of the house a little bit too?
They probably are. I've been, a lot more time at home than normal for that spring because we don't do the full baseball schedule, but we do a decent amount, and that's a lot of weekends. So I think my wife is probably ready for football to begin. She usually always is, but maybe more so this year because I've been around the house a little bit too long for her liking.
Well, okay, before I forget, when we talked to Tony Hobson a few weeks ago, he also mentioned that he's not nearly as handy around the house as
I'm glad
he
to hear
thinks he
that.
is too.
I'm glad
So
to hear
I think,
I'm not the only one.
so I think I spot a trend here.
Well, we are kind of busy, but yeah, some of those projects get hired out now or will be in the future. I know that.
Absolutely. I hear you. So I think that one of my most favorite Tiger Club meetings was the one at the country club a few years back with all of the former voices of the Tigers. So how often, I know that we've lost Mr. Schmidt, and I feel like we've lost someone else too.
Amelia recently passed away a couple of years ago, yes.
So do all of you still get together,
Yeah, we try to. We're still waiting to see what happens for this summer. That was kind of an interesting. Lon Pishney is the one responsible because the very first Tiger auction, I got a phone call and about, hey, it'd be really neat is to have an autograph football or basketball of the voices of the Tigers. And I thought that's a neat idea. So I started to organize that. I grew up listening to Bob Davis, being from Victoria. So he's, a dear friend and a mentor. And then I was going to school when Wyatt Thompson was doing the games, and he kind of took me under his wings. So good friends with them. Obviously worked with Steve. I knew Kay Melia through a mutual friend, and then obviously Mr. Schmidt. So it was easy to track people down. And it kind of started out as my wife's brother lived in Wyoming. So we would maybe go on our way up to see them, stop in Goodland. Kay would sign a ball, and then we'd get together in Manhattan, met in Aggieville. Bob would come to Manhattan, and we'd get and have lunch with Wyatt, and then I would get the other ones. Did that for several years, and then finally someone suggested, why don't we all get together and do it in one spot? And so we did that. And actually, the very first time we did that, we met at Russell's Cafe in Salina, and it was a blast. We had so much fun. Bob Schmidt's stories had us rolling on the floor. I don't know if any of us talked other than listening to him just tell his stories. And then we met in Hayes, and we decided to kind of work with this. And I think the Hayes area young professionals were involved in that, and we worked it into a Tiger Club during the summer, and it was really, really fun. That was such a neat experience. The only thing, it was interesting, and we've talked about this with Mr. Schmidt, how he was good. He had great stories, but you could tell he knew the crowd. He was a little more reserved. That first meeting in Salina, it was for some, I think, hadn't seen that side of Bob in a while. He was so funny, but that was really fun. And so we tried to, and obviously we've lost a couple of other members. There's one who did the games before Bob Davis, who is up in Michigan, and he's just unable to travel, so he's not able to join us. But that has really been fun to get together and just, relive old stories of how much the industry has changed and just the time at Fort Hays State. So that was a fun day for that Tiger Club. And we still try to, hopefully we can do that later this summer.
So you have had, I was going to say front row, but sometimes you're up in the press box. So I don't know that it's always a front row seat, but you have had a seat at some pretty amazing sporting events over the years. What are some of your favorites? Do you have favorite games?
It's funny. I get asked a lot, and this is sad. I think if you ask most coaches, I'm guessing they would have a similar answer. I probably remember losses, and losses that just sting more than wins. You kind of forget about all the wins. For me, when I think back at big games, I just remember some of the most heart-wrenching losses. And that's sad that it's that way, but they just stand out. Really good seasons that maybe didn't go. You just ask, what games stand out? I think of 2006 up in Winona, Minnesota, when the men, who were ranked number one in the country at that time, couldn't get out of that regional. And if they don't have an injury to Dennis Howard, I think they win a national or had a legit chance to win a championship. Obviously, Tony's had two great women's teams, 15 and then 2 years ago. I think if they stay healthy, I think there's at least one, if not two banners hanging inside Gross Coliseum for the women. And those are unfortunately what I remember. However, the Northwest Missouri State football games here recently, I mean, to me, three of the best games that you're ever going to see in MIAA football. To win there the first 3 years ago now, I guess, and win that conference championship and to do it on their home field, that was pretty special. And you felt going into that game the Tigers had a chance, but still it was Northwest. It was on their field, and you just got a sense as that game went along, this is something special. Then to do it again the next year, and even though Fort Hays State lost this past season at Lewis Field, that game was incredible. And to have a 56-yard field goal to force overtime, it doesn't get much more exciting than that. So recently, I think there's without a doubt those football games with Northwest Missouri State have been big. There's been so many big women's basketball games. I mean, I remember in men's games when Fort Hays State beat Central Missouri and Warrensburg when they were number one in the country and did it on the road right after Christmas. That was a great team that unfortunately Northwest or Central had a little bit better team that year and went on to the Final Four a couple of straight years and ended the Tiger seasons. But a lot of good ones, and I'm glad I can remember a few of the wins because the losses almost stand out more than the wins sometimes.
So, I've been associated with the university for about 11 years now. And I think the most amazing thing that I've been a part of is that second women's region or final game here 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Is that comparable, do you suppose, to the people who tell me the stories about back in the 80s and 90s when Gross was always packed?
Probably so. I mean, I'm fortunate being from around here. I was in high school. I was in grade school when the team in 1980 with Joe Rosado as a head coach. And I remember that Denver University game, the first time they packed it. Because for many years, I remember media guide pictures were the Harlem Globetrotters. And I was like, I can't remember, fourth grade maybe, and my dad took me and a buddy to that game, and it was packed. And that was the picture they used. And then that Denver game in 1980, in fact, it was the day the hostages were released from Iran. President Reagan was just sworn in as the president that day. I mean, it was just, there were so many other things outside of basketball. Then you had Fort Hays State and Denver University, and it was just a crazy, crazy atmosphere. So I remember that, and then all those in the mid '80s. But that was close. I mean, that was pretty close. And I also think the 1996 run when the Tiger men were undefeated. I was doing color then, but that road to Louisville, as that season gained momentum. I mean, 4,000 was a small crowd. It got to be big, and then that regional it was packed to the gills, and that was a lot like the mid '80s. So it was fun to see, and it's fun to see. And I know times are different now. There's a lot more going on. Youth sports take up a lot of people's times. But when Fort Hays State has a team like that and they get to be in big games, Tiger Nation comes out in full force, and that is so much fun. I mean, those regional tournaments the women hosted were a lot of fun, even though they didn't quite end the way Fort Hays State would have liked to have had them end. It was still a lot of fun to be a part of it, no doubt about that.
Well, and we've seen that in football too, I think.
Mm-hmm.
When I think about, again, 11 years ago when I came, and just to see no one tailgated, that just wasn't a thing, except for tailgate, once a year. And to see how that's grown, it's just amazing.
I've always said, we get a pretty good view from the press box, and it was before they redid the parking lot out there, that 4 days can just, if we can get football turned around to be a consistent winner, I think people are going to find Lewis Field on a Saturday is as good of an atmosphere as there is in college football, certainly as good as anybody's in the MIAA. And I think it's lived up to that. I mean, for a football game, I usually get to the stadium about 3 hours before kickoff. And to see people already tailgating and coming in, it's just a great Saturday game day atmosphere. And then with the reworking of the parking lot, I think it's made it even better. And it is so cool to get up in the press box and get set and just, the things we do before a broadcast to get to kind of overlook that a little bit. It's pretty cool, and it's kind of lived up to that. And all the credit has to go to Chris Brown because he's obviously done a tremendous job. But Saturdays at Lewis Field have become a pretty special place to be.
Absolutely. how close do you get to student athletes? I mean, are there still student athletes from, days gone by that you're still in touch with these days?
It's usually we'll run into them and see them and talk about, the teams they were on. I mean, we are, to an extent, we have great access. The coaches at Fort Hays State are phenomenal to give us the access we need to do interviews and do all the different things we need to prepare for a broadcast. So you do, and obviously, like anything else, some you become friends with. So it is kind of neat, whether it's when the women are hosting a regional and former players come back and you get a chance to say hi to Kate Lehman, who came back to watch the games, or whoever they are, someone who played even earlier, football players who, maybe played for Chris Brown his early years when he was just starting to get things turned around and you haven't seen for a long time. And maybe you have to ask the coach, who was that? Because they changed how they've looked so much. But to say, we call them up, usually not, but we still, when you see them at different events, it's fun to reminisce. And one of the things you ask, what does a sportscaster do with no sports? We've started a podcast called the Defend the Fort podcast. And I know Ryan and his sports information staff, who do such a phenomenal job, they've kind of done one with current student athletes. We kind of took ours to the approach of, let's try to catch up with some of the former student athletes and chat with them and just relive their days. That has been a total blast to reunite with some of them and chat about their time at Fort Hays State. It is pretty neat, and you always find that it's a special time for them, even if they weren't on teams that were great or they were on phenomenal teams. When you get them reminiscing and telling old stories, it's a lot of fun.
I recommend Mike Garrison if you can track him down.
Well, he's on the list. It's funny because there's so many. The
hungriest student I've ever known.
That's every student athlete, aren't they? He was phenomenal. He was part of he was on some pretty good teams. That was fun, and then obviously it's gone in only upwards since he played.
Absolutely. He's one of those people. I wonder if he were on one of Chris's teams.
Yeah.
How amazing that would be.
Mm-hmm.
He was such a good quarterback, and still has many records. Still, right?
He still does. Yes,
absolutely.
He had some pretty good receivers to throw to in that group too.
That's true. All right, so we do have some questions for you here.
All right.
Do you ever get so excited during a live broadcast that you forget that you're on air?
I don't think so. I do get excited. I try to. It's funny. Probably when I was younger, I might have gone a little bit more over the top. I've tried to control that a little bit, but I think big plays I just naturally get excited about. So that's been, I'll go back and I'll listen to games and I'll hear some and cringe. It's like, wow, that was a little bit too over the top. So I've tried to control the excitement, but yet if they can't understand what you're saying, it really is kind of pointless. So I usually am pretty cognizant of everything. I go to that 56-yard field goal last season by Dante to tie it. I was pretty excited about the call. I felt I nailed it, but then my voice cracks at the end. And while it's happening, I could tell I was kind of hoping to get through the call, and it kind of cracks at the end. It may have added to it. I don't know. I hear that. I kind of cringe when I hear it because the voice cracked, but usually pretty much aware of it. And just, you hope you capture the big play, the key play at the right time, but not get too excited to where the listeners can't understand what you're saying, because that kind of defeats the whole purpose and the point.
I totally get that. Is it hard to hold your tongue sometimes?
Yeah. Yeah. And for basketball, especially, because we get to sit right by the bench at home games and a lot of the road games. I don't know that that's good. I almost probably prefer to be across from the bench, because I do get to hear coach and official conversations. And sometimes that's not good because you get wrapped up in it. And then, let's face it, we're all human, but you usually get same officials more than once. And sometimes just over time, there's a history. And you understand that this coach and this official don't quite get along. And there could be fireworks. So I try very hard to not let that get too wrapped up in the broadcast. Sometimes it does. And, listeners at home really don't want to hear you ragging on an official. I really try not to. I don't think that's, they're trying to do their best, but sometimes calls are made that are key into a football game or a basketball game. And so you have to bring it up. And so being that close, but if you're across from the floor, you still get a feel for it, but you don't hear the actual conversation. So maybe you don't get quite as worked up. I go back to the playoff football game, talk about games you remember. That's one I remember up at Indianapolis. And still disappointed in that because I think 4 days is the better team. And unfortunately, I've seen the video, an awful targeting call changed that game. And I didn't want to harp on that during the broadcast, but yet we had to mention it throughout the rest of the game because the game changed on that call. I mean, Indy admitted they changed their game plan when Dwayne was disqualified for that call. So that was a key play in the game, and you always try to recap as you go. And unfortunately, it was an official's call that was a very important part of that contest. So, again, people, I think, get tired of you harping on officials and how they're calling a game. But in that situation, that was probably the biggest play of the game, and you had to keep referring to it. But there's ways you can do it without being mean. But, yeah, sometimes it's hard. You got to bite your tongue a little bit, and it's not always easy.
Apart from the former voices of the Tigers, are there any sportscasters that you idolize and look up to and try to emulate?
Obviously, like I said, I grew up listening to Bob Davis, so he's, right there on the top of my list. And Wyatt, right there with him. Wyatt, was very instrumental in helping me get started and learning. My first job was in Phillipsburg, Kansas, and Tad Feltz, a Fort Hays State alum, took me under his wings for 2 years and learned a lot. Probably learned from Tad more than anything else is where to eat, because we never went to a bad place in my 2 years. And there's a few places we'd walk into and I was a little unsure, but he knew the spots for food. So, and that's an important part. We're on the road a lot, so you got to have good places to dine. And then obviously, I grew up, we always had the radio on, and so the Royals on radio were a big part of it. Fred White, Denny Matthews. I was very fortunate to get to meet Fred White because he owns the radio stations in Russell before he passed. And he was a super great guy that would do anything for any broadcaster in the States. So I would say those are the ones that have had the biggest impact on me. Obviously, you look at the national level, Vin Scully's the gold standard, and everybody strives to be like that, but it's pretty hard to live up to that. But those are the main people that have probably had the biggest influence in my life.
So not Mitch Holthus?
Well, no, I leave Mitch out. I shouldn't say that. Yeah, Mitch has actually become a good friend because we do a weekly radio on one of our radio spot on one of our stations that carries the Chiefs, and he's great. And he's not a Fort Hays State alum. He went to K-State, but he's a Tiger fan. We talk about Fort Hays State a lot on our weekly shows about the Chiefs, and he keeps track of the Tigers. That's been pretty fun. And living in Kansas City, he's in the middle of MIAA territory. And when Fort Hays State won back-to-back MIAA titles, he let folks know. So he may not be a Tiger, but he's a Tiger at heart. We've got him wearing black and gold when he's not wearing Chiefs red and gold.
And have you ever described a win as a big
I never
win,
have.
or?
It's funny. That was his phrase. I don't know if I have a signature call, but when I call a touchdown, it's usually touchdown Fort Hays State. And when I was doing Hays High and TMP, it was touchdown Hays High, touchdown TMP. Well, then Mitch gets the Chiefs job, and it's touchdown Kansas City. I was doing touchdown and then the team's name before them because he was doing the big. And then I, kind of worry that does it sound too much like Mitch Holthus in his touchdown Kansas City call. So I really try not to get Fort Hays, too much into that. So it sounds like it's his call, but that's something I've always done, touchdown and then the team. So I've kind of stuck with that, but I try to not make it sound too much like Kansas City. Even though I don't think he stole it from me, but I like to say he did.
I'll go with that. I think everybody on the call goes with that, right? We're sure that's what happened.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, next question, Mike Slattery. How many miles on average do you drive in a normal school year?
That's funny you would ask. Every year I want to keep track of one season, and then about February I realize I haven't kept track. So maybe this year, this will be a different year because it won't be the full schedule. I want to try to keep track. It's a lot. It's not as bad as it was when we were in the RMAC. Those were some long road trips. But there's still some long ones in the MIAA. The difference between the two conferences, though, there were certain trips, like if we're going to Durango, you had to fill gas here and you had to get a bite to eat because you weren't going to have a chance for a long time. At least in the MIAA, we have options along our trips, so we can maybe change it up a little bit and do different things because a lot more interstate driving. So that has made it nice to have a few more options of where we might want to stop to eat. But it's a lot of miles, and by mid-February, I become maybe a little bit cranky because I'm not getting quite as much sleep as I normally would. But I don't mind the travel. It's kind of fun, even though there's some long days involved with it. But for Mike, I'll try to remember and keep track and have a full season count of what we normally do.
I'm sure he would appreciate that. All right. Mark Griffin has a question for you. In your opinion, who have been the best or perhaps the most fun basketball players that you've seen in a Tiger uniform, both men and women?
Dominic Jones for the men comes to mind. He was so talented. I mean, he was one of our podcast guests, and it was fun to chat with him and just reminisce. He was so good. I mean, he was so talented. And you see what he's done since, and trying to, hopefully they have the Olympics next year, but for the USA Olympic team to become one of the best 3-on-3 basketball players in the country and in the world. But he was so talented. That team he was on, that's one of those disappointing ends that you remember the losses more than the wins, because that team almost beat an Elite 8 K-State team in a real game and had them on the ropes. And unfortunately, we can get into Division II postseason play for basketball and the injustices there. That team should never had to be at Central Oklahoma and play them. But anyway, he was certainly one of them. But for the women, there's been so many good ones here in this recent run by Tony Hobson. I'll probably leave too many people out. But, there's just been so many. I mean, Tatiana Leggett here in recent years, from where she was when she stepped onto campus to the career she had and when she left is phenomenal. But for the women, I almost think more of a collective group, because they were each on groups. They were talented, but they had other players on their teams. Maddie Holland in softball, I think, is one that's, when you're the best player in the program, I don't think you can argue that. But I do remember, too, those mid-'80s teams, and even though I wasn't on the broadcast, Edgar Eason is as good, I think, that's ever played at Fort Hays State. And, Raymond Lee, point guard, he's kind of the guy everybody's measured up to at that position. I wasn't on the broadcast then. I was still going to high school, but they were pretty darn good players. And it gets hard to pick the best or top 3 or 4 because there's been so many really good ones that come through Fort Hays State.
So I have a question from the room that I'm in here, and we'll get to that in a minute. But do you think that you'll have anyone following in your footsteps coming on?
Well, I've got a son who, at least as of now, thinks he'd like to do what Dad does, and that's pretty cool. We do Larks games in the summer, the Hays Larks, and they make the World Series, he usually gets a couple of innings, which has been kind of fun to be there in the booth with him. But if I'd had the opportunities he's had, getting to go to practice since he was, knee high to me, being a part of that is kind of, the access, and it's just something he's grown up with. And I still remember clearly one of the practices, he was pretty young, and A.J. Blazik, I don't know if folks remember him, he was an offensive coordinator and worked with the offensive line, and it was a bad day of practice, and he kind of lit into his team with some very colorful language, and I just remember him looking up and seeing probably I don't know how old Garrett was, but not very old, 5 or 6, just staring at him, eyes wide open, and him apologizing profusely for maybe some of the colorful language he used. And I just told him, hey, it's nothing he hasn't heard from his mother in the kitchen, so don't worry about it. And I always told Garrett, whatever you hear at practice, it stays at practice. That's the deal. And if you ever, because coaches sometimes need to motivate in different ways, and if that ever spills out at home, you don't get to go anymore. And he has been pretty good about that.
That's good to know. So that's all the questions. We're right at our half hour. And as always, this has gone very quickly. Do we have any other questions from our audience? We want to be respectful of everyone's time. If you do, just go ahead and unmute yourself, because I can't see you necessarily. Anyone?
Do you have a story about being on Van Brunt Boulevard?
I saw that name. I wondered if that wasn't who it was. Yeah, that's a buddy of mine. We went to a Royals. In fact, it was right after I graduated. Roger Clemens was pitching against the Royals. So I think they still did Friday night graduations. So we left for a Royals game to watch Roger Clemens face Kansas City. Got as close as we could, general admission. It rained, it flooded. Kansas City it was a mess. So we're going to another game. And somebody in our travel party suggested taking Van Brunt because it's a quicker way to get to the stadium. And the fact no one was going in that direction should have been our first sign. And then as we turn, the road's underwater. So then we get in this line of cars that took us like from Van Brunt Boulevard to Kauffman Stadium's about 2 miles. It felt like 2 days. So yeah. Talked about coaches sometimes having colorful language. Someone suggested that route. Maybe a little frustrated with.
All right. Do we have any other questions? I keep hearing noises, so okay. So I think that will then conclude our day. I want to thank Gerard again for being here. It's always a pleasure. And you've been very supportive of the Alumni Association throughout the years. Whenever I've asked for you to do some sort of cool voiceover for us.
The highlight of the year is always the bonfire. I mean, that's
well, absolutely, and hopefully we'll be able to do a bonfire.
So.
It's outside. We can socially distance and yeah, that's always, you do a great job with that, and we certainly appreciate it. And whenever we call on you, you're always great. So we certainly appreciate all of that as well. Next week, we will have Karen McCullough, who is the Director of Career Services, with us. I will not be your host next week. The person who will be hosting is sitting right next to me here, Tammy Wellbrock, also known as A, my boss, and B, Gerard's boss.
Very well.
So she'll be taking my spot. I'll be out at the Ellis County Fair. Please join us for that. And the following week, we'll have Dr. Teresa Clounge, who is one of the assistant vice presidents for student affairs and is our chief diversity officer. So we're going to talk about some of the topics in the news and with how we're handling those things at Forte State. So again, thank you, Gerard. It's always a pleasure. And thanks to everyone. Hopefully we will see you all again next week.